a different life, I feel like I would love doing what you do, because that's like part of what I love about acting too. It's just like the psychology and getting to connect with people. So it's cool that like through this work too, I'm like getting to connect with people and talk about these things.
Yeah, I feel like acting and theater and psychology, they go hand in hand so well. Like I love working with actors because y'all are so much more in touch with your emotions than the average person is. There's a willingness there, right? Because so many people are like, ooh, feelings, you know, whereas your line of work is to like really sit with the feelings. So I think that's a strength, you know?
Yeah, and that's what it's like at the very deepest level as an actor. Like what I love is being able to like... Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Imperfect Podcast. I'm your host, Kirsten Pfeiffer, and I'm joined today by Dr. Lauren Cook, who is a therapist, a career coach, an author, and a speaker. Lauren really is passionate about helping individuals through seasons of transition, so we're going to be talking a lot about that today, especially as we're kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel here with the COVID, and many of us will probably find ourselves in a transitional season. She's also really passionate about helping people with mental health, so we're going to be talking about that, as well as equipping people to really cultivate a life that is in alignment with their values. So I am so excited to have you here today. Lauren is just finishing up her postdoctoral work at Claremont College and is about to step into her own private practice, and she just is constantly creating tools for people, whether that be courses or online digital content or books. And I'm really grateful that you're here with us today. So welcome, Lauren.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thanks so much for having me. And I love that we're fellow Bruins, too.
I know. I didn't even know that when we first connected. And then in our first conversation, we were like, oh my gosh, go Bruins, studied the same thing.
Yep,
so
both
this
communications majors.
Yes, full circle. I love it.
Awesome.
So one of the things that we were talking about in preparation for this is anxiety. And I feel like kind of getting into what I was just saying in the intro about being in this transitional season, seeing ourselves with the light at the end of the tunnel. And anytime there's change, I know even in my life, I feel anxiety. Yeah. And the CDC actually had a report recently saying that during August 2020 to February 2021, the percentage of adults with recent symptoms of anxiety or a depressive disorder increased from 36.4% to 41.5%. And I'm not an expert, but that seems like a pretty significant increase.
Yeah.
So do you think that's mostly pandemic related or?
I really do. I think it's completely pandemic related, and it's going to be really interesting to see how people respond to this next year, right? Yeah. We're actually seeing a lot of people say they're experiencing re-entry anxiety, which is very common. If you think about it, anxiety is so much we want to avoid, right? Yeah. If something makes us feel afraid, what do we want to do? We want to pull back. We kind of, if people were anxious before the pandemic, we kind of got our wish, right? Yeah. To stay home all day and not have to do the things that make us anxious, whether it's giving a speech or going in to ask for a promotion at work. Things that would normally invite some healthy anxiety didn't have to do that this past year. So our threshold to engage in things is much, much lower. So I think we should expect this fall, this summer, that people are going to probably see a spike in anxiety because straight speaking, we're kind of out of shape with our social skills.
Yeah,
right?
No, absolutely. I've even found that myself recently. Like I was just at a wedding last weekend and I didn't know anyone at the wedding besides the bride and the groom. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have to remember how to like talk to people and like make friends. And
small talk, what is that?
Right, but like I love what you said about healthy anxiety, that like I felt that, but it like propelled me into putting myself out there and then like walked away from the weekend meeting so many amazing new people. So I would love to dive more into that. Like, how would you define anxiety and what's kind of the distinction between healthy anxiety and when it becomes crippling?
Yeah, I love that question. So actually, people listening, go Google this. It's called the Yerkes-Dodson model, and it's this bell-shaped curve, and it's the idea that we actually need some anxiety to perform well in our lives. Like, if we have no anxiety, no stress, we're all going to sit on the couch all day and go on Netflix binges, which maybe we do that anyway sometimes, right? But we do need a little anxiety to care, right? To study for a test, to go in for a performance, whatever it might look like for people. Now, with this model, when we start going down the curve, it starts to become crippling and too much, right? And there's 4 things I really note for people, the difference between just feeling stressed and having something like an anxiety disorder. What are those 4 things? One is the person's actually distressed about their symptoms. They're saying, I'm worried about this. This is not normal for me to feel this way. The second piece is that there's some dysfunction. You're not showing up for work. You're canceling plans with your friends, whatever that might look like for you. Third thing is there's what we call deviance from the norm. What is your norm? And are you noticing that you're not engaging in your normal behavior? Things are out of whack for you. And last, this one is stronger, but if there's any danger where you're worried about safety to yourself or safety for someone else. So I call those the 4 Ds, and those are big indicators of when the anxiety is maybe getting into that unhealthy range.
Wow, yeah, that's really important because I think sometimes we're like, oh, these emotions that I'm feeling, whether it's anxiety or something else, is bad, but it can be an indicator of something else going on. So even if we're deviating from that unhealthy level of your normal anxiety, I feel like anxiety being present could indicate that there's a deeper root there, that something's off, and that. But I think with the pandemic, what was kind of a blessing is instead of having all these distractions to avoid what's really going on, we were forced to sit and look at like, okay, what are the things that are going on? Because I know for me, sometimes when I'm feeling anxious, I'm like, oh, I'm just going to do more and more and more and busy myself to not really face what's going on there.
No, 100%. And I mean, that's why I really encourage my clients, get curious about your anxiety rather than feel threatened by it of like, oh, this is some scary thing I have to run away from. Get curious about the anxiety because often anxiety is actually the body's way of trying to be your friend. It's the body's way of saying like, hey, look out for this, right? And that's where your brain has to come back in and say, okay, is that a healthy level or is this taking over my life, right? That's the key with the work is that, look, anxiety is going to be present for each of us. How do we still live a meaningful life in spite of that anxiety? Rather than focusing on trying to make it go away, how do you still choose to live that meaningful life even when little anxiety's there? That's okay.
Absolutely. And just for anyone listening, if they are feeling more of a level of anxiety, especially I think many of us, myself included, like as we're in this transitional period, I am finding myself getting more anxious about things. So when you notice that anxiety, what are some practical tools that people can use to work through that?
Absolutely. I love that question. One is slow down. Slow down because anxiety is very fast, right? We want to go, 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 go. And so slowing down, coming into our bodies, starting to breathe deep, that's really, really healthy to do, right? The other thing that I really like to encourage people to remember is that we all experience anxiety, right? I think sometimes anxiety tells us, oh, this is just me. I'm the only one. I'm weird. I'm strange. I'm awkward. Look around. We can all tell that everybody right now is maybe a little nervous. And I think that really humanizes each of us of like, you know what? We all feel anxious sometimes and that's okay. And I think that helps us exhale together.
Absolutely. I love that because it is. I think anytime we're talking about mental health and something negative mental health feelings that we're feeling, I've found that the first thing I want to do is hide it. And then when you don't share it with anyone, then shame creeps in. And then shame tells you you're alone, there's something wrong with you. And the more that, and part of the reason why the name of this podcast is Imperfect is like the more that we share these quote unquote imperfections or the things that we're feeling, the more that not only can we be connected, but you give the space for someone else to realize that they're not alone in it either. So I think as anything, like awareness is the key. So as we're in this transition, realizing, having grace for ourselves, but also for other people. If maybe they're not showing up in the way that you need them to right now, that we're all kind of experiencing this anxiety. So
yeah, 100%. I think it humanizes all of us. I'm often kind of partly joking, but it's true. Like I wish everybody could be inside a therapy room for 8 hours a day and see client after client that comes in that shares their embarrassing story or their cringeworthy moment, because then we would all know, wow, we're all trying to go through life as best we can. We're all feeling anxious. We all feel sad sometimes. It's just part of the human experience. And I think if people could see what happens behind the curtain for so many of us, really for all of us, I think we would all feel a lot closer because
Absolutely.
we're not all just wearing a mask when we're in front of each other anymore.
Absolutely. And even just looking at this past year, I feel like there was a lot of polarization that happened.
Yeah.
And the more that we can focus that we are human beings, we all have these feelings, and that we actually have a lot more in common than not. And I think part of the polarization came from the fact that we were all experiencing this trauma and this anxiety, and instead of processing it healthily and having that community, I think people got really further into their echo chamber. So I love the work that you do too, to kind of bring light to people's anxiety and the fact that we all are in this together. And the other thing in that study that I mentioned with the CDC was that they noticed that the increases in anxiety were largest among adults aged 18 to 29 years old. This is interesting, especially because I fall into this range. So I'm like, but why, like you as the expert, like why do you think this is present?
I think there's a lot of reasons. And, as a therapist working with college students, I really saw this acutely. What it is, I believe, about this season of life, from high school years through college years in the 20s, you can't get those milestones back in a lot of ways. You can't redo a prom. You can't redo a college graduation. Your time in college, that year goes by, And so I think for that age group, there were a lot of milestones, a lot of rites of passage that when you don't get to go through those, especially in the way that you maybe see other people going through them in the past, it really, I think, brings up a lot of tension for people. And I saw this happen for a lot of people, a grieving reaction, actually, of, feeling shock, feeling anger, feeling disappointment, but then adding on a layer of, well, I shouldn't be feeling this way because other people are going through it so much worse. So then we're invalidating our feelings on top of it. So much of my work this past year was trying to just make space for people to feel sad that you didn't get to have a normal sophomore year, or to feel sad that you couldn't go out to the bars with your friend on the weekend, right? I mean, whatever it is that people like to do to have fun and engage. The 20s is such a time of social building, right? With friendships. And so not getting to have that, there's such a sense of loss.
Wow.
And I think people need to validate that loss for themselves.
Totally. No matter what age group you're in. I think that's so true. Throughout the pandemic, it was like, oh, well, like these things are happening, but at least I didn't lose my job. But that doesn't mean that maybe your job actually got way more intense because you were working from home. And so maybe someone felt guilt because they're like, well, I shouldn't be feeling this. I should be grateful. But realizing that you're under a lot of stress too. I love what you said too about the grieving process. Like we all lost something, I think, in the past year and a half, whether it be a loved one or whether it just be plans that we had or things that we had worked towards. It's like that still counts. And I think that when we try to invalidate that, it doesn't do anyone any help,
No, completely. We've got to just make room for our feelings, whatever came up for us in this past year. And that's why I'm such a big advocate of nuance and complexity of emotion, right? Because you mentioned I should feel grateful, right? And I think a lot of people fall into this all or nothing feeling space of like, I should be grateful or I'm fully sad. And it's like, you can hold both those things together, right? And so I think when we give ourselves permission to hold nuance of emotion, we connect way more with other people. We have a lot more empathy for others' experience and a lot more empathy for our own experience too.
Yeah. And what are some ways that someone can practice that nuance of emotion?
Simply put, it's called distress tolerance, which is this idea of getting comfortable being uncomfortable. And that can happen in a lot of ways. It's sitting with somebody who holds a different opinion than you, rather than just immediately blocking them. Can you sit and have a little bit of a conversation? Doesn't mean you don't have to agree by any means, but can you sit and hold space, right? Other things that you can do is, can you sit in your emotional experience, whether it's having a vulnerable conversation with a friend, rather than, numbing yourself out with an Instagram scroll or binging in the kitchen, right? It's sitting with discomfort, which I think a lot of us, we've honestly lost practice doing.
Yeah. And I'm a huge advocate for journaling because I feel like a lot of times it starts with, it's hard for us to be vulnerable with other people because I think a lot of times it's hard for us to be vulnerable with ourselves and like what's really going on. And I found times talking about anxiety, even if I'm feeling anxious and I don't know why, and I just start journaling and all of a sudden things are coming up and I'm like, oh, whoa, I didn't know that was going on. Because so much of it is subconscious, and we get into these patterns of I don't know, like like my brain's in so many different places right now, but like, you know this because you were a therapist and a mental health expert, but we have these patterns that for so long have been telling us certain things, and that we don't even realize that those things are in our head space, you know? So with that, I know that we've talked about toxic positivity.
Yes.
And that's why it's actually so important to be honest and vulnerable with ourselves, because if we're just like, I should be happy, I should be grateful, that there's this thing called toxic positivity that can creep in. So what is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm a reformed toxic positivity I don't think that's a word, but you know, before I became a therapist, my whole brand was called the Sunny Girl. I'd go out on the road and I'd speak about happiness. And, you know, I'd find that for a lot of people, it was hard to resonate with a message like that, because I think a lot of people right now are not only struggling with what brings them happiness, they're struggling to just be okay.
Yeah.
You know? And so I think sometimes that idea of just be happy or choose happiness, I think it's like nails on a chalkboard for people, because I think they would tell you, you know, hey, if it was that easy, I would.
Right.
You know? So I think it's learning how to settle down and sit with ourselves and be okay with not always being okay.
Absolutely.
You know? And I think toxic positivity, it's not just how we speak to ourselves, it's, I think, almost more importantly, how we speak with others who are going through a hard time, right? Because a classic phrase of toxic positivity is everything happens for a reason. Yeah. Well, for someone who's just lost a child, hearing a comment like that, how can that happen for a reason, right? And yet we have these platitudes in our society that when we feel uncomfortable, let me just pull out a platitude and hand that on a platter to you. Yeah. And yet we've really got to get curious about, how does that actually make people feel when I say that to them?
Absolutely. And just, there's something so powerful about just sitting with someone in their pain and saying, you know, I know there's nothing I can say right now that will make this better, but I'm here for you.
Yes.
Like, and that's all, because I mean, it does come out of a loving place of everything happens for a reason. You're trying to comfort that person, but I think we have to risk making ourselves feel uncomfortable and not necessarily knowing what to say, and just don't say anything, you know, like, but just being there for someone.
Yeah, so well said. And, you know, it's okay to one, not always know what to say, and it's okay to say the wrong thing too sometimes, right? I think we get so afraid of saying the wrong thing that we get paralyzed sometimes in our conversations, and really starting to hold that people actually have a lot more compassion for each other than we give ourselves credit.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, and I think that we're in this time where we've honestly lost the art of conversation.
Yes.
Because, and everyone's so, it comes back to the fear and like the cancel culture that we're in. And, you know, even with like a lot of the social justice things, I found myself afraid to say anything publicly because I was like, I'm going to say the wrong thing and then I'm going to be canceled. And so then we didn't say anything. And then it's interesting to see how that translates into our interpersonal relationships, especially when someone's going through pain and mental health issues and grief. And so I think realizing, like you said, like we all have a lot more compassion for each other than we realize, and that if we're willing to be wrong, and that actually is where I think a lot of this healing will come, is just being able to realize what other people are going through and how sometimes you might say something that might be triggering to someone, and that's okay as long as you're willing. Like, none of us are perfect.
No.
Yeah.
And that's when we learn, right? But if we always keep ourselves held back, which is what anxiety tells us to do, avoid, don't say anything, don't show up, we never get those golden learning opportunities. And we lack those moments of major connection with people. So we've got to be willing to be vulnerable. And I'll add this too. If someone is unwilling to forgive, or if someone is cruel after we've made a mistake, that's some stuff going on with them, right? And rather than internalize and personalize that of like, I'm this terrible, awful person, okay, have some compassion for yourself. You're a human being, you're learning, you're showing up. And I think that deserves maybe a little credit.
Yeah, that's so important, because I've definitely found where before I did a lot more work on myself, I would take any criticism or mean words from someone as, oh, this is me. I need to shrink back. I need to get smaller. And it caught, just like anxiety sometimes wants us to not show up, like that rejection almost, or that criticism can also, I think, lead us to not want to show up. And so I love that you said that. And kind of getting into talking about the transitional thing, so much of what we're saying is how these things, whether it be anxiety or fear of criticism of others, keep us from stepping into, just being fully present and maybe even just the dreams that we have.
Yeah.
So I know a lot of your work is with career coaching and kind of helping people step into what are their convictions, what do they really want, and how can they get connected to their purpose and their intention. And so I think that one cool thing that may have come out of this past year is that we all were forced to really take stock of where we're at.
Yeah.
I know so many friends that are actors that are like, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, I've just been on the grind for so long, and I realized I don't even like this. So I think that there's a lot of room for growth as we're kind of in this transitional season. So I'd love to just hear some of your thoughts on that and like how people can really like steward this time well.
Oof, that's a great question. And I think it's so true. I mean, in my own life as a speaker, I was on the road, multiple weekends out of every month, and it made me reevaluate, like, do I really want to be on the road this much? Not really, right? Sometimes, but not all the time. And so I think this year really did make us reevaluate in big, big ways what matters to us. Because listen, time is finite.
Yeah.
We only have so much time in this life. And this is a serious question, but I think it's important for everybody to ask themselves, when you're at the end of your life, how will you have wanted to spend your time?
Well, yeah.
And if the way you're spending your time right now is not something that feels congruent to you, sit with the discomfort of that and start to be willing to think about making a change, right? Because it's anxiety that tells us you can't make a change. You're not capable. You can't get by on, a salary cut if it means pursuing your passion. All these different things we tell ourselves, right? So that's why so much of my work as a career coach in particular is helping people identify their values and what actually matters to them. Because so many of us were just going through the motions. We're playing it safe. And then you have people who, have these midlife crises where they realize, I hate my life. I'm so miserable.
Yeah.
Right? What if in our 20s we started having those questions and conversations? I think we might see people's lives looking a little bit different.
Yeah. And what are some ways, I know that you have like full-on courses on this, so we can just do very, very like overview, but what are some ways that people can start to figure out what they really value if they're not clear on that? Because I think a lot of times we can realize that something's off and maybe that you're not in the perfect match for what you really love. But, that's the first step. But then a lot of times people don't even know beyond that what they truly would want to do. So how would you recommend, if someone's listening to this, how can they get more connected to their values?
Yeah, a few things. One, go on my website. I have an Activate Values handout, totally free resource. I walk you through over 100 values and you come away with your top 10. So I think that's really a helpful tool to get people started. Other thing that I really recommend, we do not utilize mentorship enough as a society. And I really recommend, if there's even something you're remotely interested in, send them an email and ask, hey, could I interview you for 20 minutes? I'd love to learn more about what does your day-to-day job look like. And that's a great way for people to just ask some questions. We don't ask enough questions when it comes to career. So start with those two things to get going, and I think you'll get more clarity from there.
Yeah, I love that. I know previously I've been afraid to ask people questions, and and I'm talking to even my dad right now. He's getting ready to retire. And so the last few years for him have honestly been about like, he's reached all of the milestones in his career that he was aspiring to.
Yeah.
And now where he finds the most fulfillment and value and joy is helping other people along the way.
That's awesome.
And I think a lot of times I have to like fight this, but I feel like I'm a burden to people by asking them those questions. Oh, they're so established and so busy, they wouldn't have time for me. But I think that any successful person has gotten there through the help of other successful people.
Yes.
And that they constantly are willing. And part of what makes them continue to be successful is that they do help others. So
yeah, it's that fearlessness piece. I mean, one of my mantras is 5 seconds of courage.
Wow.
Who can you go up to and ask a question to? I used to work at E! Way I got that job was, working at NBC, we're covering The Voice. I walk over and ask, hey, do you have any internships?
Wow.
Like, what do you have to lose?
Yeah.
So I'm constantly telling my clients and anybody listening, ask that, send that DM, right?
Yeah.
Send that email. Ask that connection to connect you with somebody else. you never know what's going to come out of it. And when we don't choose our 5 seconds of courage, we often choose our 5 minutes or 5 years of regret when we think, what would have happened if I had just asked that question?
Absolutely. And my dad, again, talking about this episode dedicated to my dad. No, but he always says the answer is no if you don't ask. So you're still going to end up at the worst case scenario is they say no and you're still in the same position. So I think that like wrapping our head around that, and courage is like a muscle. I found the more that you ask, the easier it is. I mean, even this podcast has been like an exercise in that for me. I've had to reach out to complete strangers. Like Lauren and I didn't know each other before this. And now like, look, we're having this great conversation. So I think what's on the other side of that courage can be so great.
Yeah.
And the worst that can happen is you're exactly where you started, you know?
Exactly. No, I love that phrase, that courage is a muscle. It is. And it's professional and it's personal. I mean, I asked my husband out on the first date and look, 11 years later, you never know.
I love that.
So, you know, especially if there's any ladies listening today, find your courage.
Absolutely. I think that's so fun. I mean, we can do a whole other podcast about that. But so many times, again, it gets back to the anxiety and the fear, and that causes us to remain small and But a lot of times, even talking about dating, like the men are also anxious and fearful sometimes. And so just being willing to put yourself out there, whether it be in dating or in a relationship or career, it's all about courage.
Yeah.
And I also really love how a lot of your content focuses on intentionality and not just letting life happen to us, and how we talked about this, but the past year, I think one of the things that came out of it was realizing how much of us were just in this cycle of continuously going on auditions when you're not actually wanting to be an actor, or like burning yourself out with speaking if that's not 100% what you want to be doing. So how can we live more intentionally?
It does come back to slowing down. I mean, I think this past year with the pandemic, we really saw we were going so fast. I mean, we didn't even know what to do with ourselves when we slowed down. And I struggle with that still. I am a perpetual to-do list maker. And, you know, like this week, I'm setting the intention and I'm holding myself accountable. No to-do list. Like simply allow yourself to be rather than do constantly. And I think that's going to help us have a lot more intentionality. And, you know, I'm reading an interesting book right now. It's called Doing Nothing.
Wow.
And it's a great read. I'm actually about to launch a brain health book club, and that's going to be one of the books we have in the lineup. But it's essentially this idea that, especially in American culture, we work ourselves to death.
Wow.
And for what? You know? So I think we really have to ask ourselves, where is my identity rooted besides my career and what I do for a living? What are my relationships like? What is my free time and my self-care like? You know, I think these are questions we need to ask ourselves, because even with Generation Z right now, average Generation Z person will tell you they only have one best friend.
Wow.
One friend. I find that really concerning. And so especially as things start to open up, I think we really need to reevaluate our priorities a little bit and maybe really reinvest in our relationships that don't always have tangible outcomes the same way work does.
Yeah, wow, that's brilliant. And I think that I noticed that too. It's like so much of what my value previously, before I did this work, had been attached to is like, and it starts with our society too. What do you do?
Yeah.
You know, and also what we ask kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? It puts this idea in our head from a very young age that your value is going to be attached to what you do when you grow up. And so it's not our fault that we've kind of put our value in those things, because that's the way that our society has programmed us. And so there's nothing, again, all these things, it's like realizing there's nothing wrong with you, but recognizing where can we grow from this?
Yeah.
And so I think that really taking that time of like, there's more to life than just my career. And actually, a lot of times when you take the time to slow down and stop doing, I found that's when I have moments of creativity and inspiration. And then that actually fuels into my work in ways that like I couldn't have strived myself to get to that point. So sometimes I think it's a backwards way of thinking, but when we make that time and space and create that opportunity for us to slow down, God, the universe, whatever you believe, like blesses that, because we were created to just be much more simple than,
no, absolutely. I love that idea of like, when you allow yourself to be bored or slow down, that's when the creativity comes up.
Yeah.
And yet I think we've become, one, afraid of boredom, and two, we have found so many ways to not be bored that we don't even give ourselves time to do that deeper processing. And that's why you get this like feeling sludge of like, ooh, I'm not feeling great. And yet I'm keeping myself so busy, I'm not actually slowing down to diagnose what that's actually about.
Yeah, and especially with like being on our phones constantly. And you mentioned about Gen Z. I tutor kids that are Gen Z technically, and it's like they're constantly on their devices. And so even though they're like communicating with each other through that devices, like the quality of relationship, no wonder they only have one best friend, you know? I'm optimistic though, because I think that there is a lot more awareness around all of this. And after a year of slowing down, we have that opportunity to grow. Okay, so you know the author of Eat, Pray, Love, Elizabeth Gilbert.
I love her.
Yeah, so she has this TED Talk, and she talks about how after she came out with Eat, Pray, Love, everyone was like, you're doomed. Like, what's next? Like, because you have this big success, and they're like, oh, you're never gonna match up, you know? Like all of her author friends were saying that.
Aww.
And so she went on this TED Talk talking about how in our culture, we talk about genius as like a person, but back in the Greek, I think it was the Greek times, they talked about genius as this like force that would visit you.
Oh, wow.
And so she talks about how like, and so for them, if someone created this like masterpiece, it was because it was the genius came and it was our job to be a vessel of that genius.
Wow.
And so she has like brought that into her work of like, it's not on me to be a genius with today or with this next book. It's my job to show up because the genius can't work through you if you aren't there showing up and willing to do the work.
Wow.
And so that has been like changed my perspective on my creative work too, because we put so much pressure on ourselves to perform.
Yeah.
And all I have to do is show up and be willing to write. My writing teacher puts this into our like kind of curriculum and mindset, but you know, just show up and I'm going to write for 2 hours today. And even if I just sit there staring at my screen, I showed up and I created that space for the genius to show up. And so
I love that. I bet she talks about that in her book, Big Magic, which I need to read. It's interesting you bring her up because you know how sometimes like there's certain people or topics that keep coming up for you?
Yeah.
She is one right now.
No way.
So I need to check it.
I love that.
Everybody says her work, Big Magic, after Eat, Pray, Love is just as good.
Okay.
So
well, maybe it's because she allowed the genius to show up. Yeah, but again, it comes back to slowing down and creating that space. So yeah, we obviously talked about a lot today. If you could leave listeners with one takeaway, what would it be?
Ooh.
It's a loaded question.
I know, that's hard. That your anxiety is okay. You know, I think we do become so fearful of our anxiety, and like we were saying earlier, just getting curious about it, making some room for it, and rather than try and push it away, actually allow some acceptance for the anxiety to be. You know, so much of what I practice as a clinician is what's called acceptance and commitment therapy, which is about accepting the discomfort in our lives. And counterintuitively, that's when often our anxiety, our depression goes down because we're not shaming ourselves. We're not trying to force it away, right? Because oftentimes the more you push something, the more it comes up even bigger, right? And so allow the anxiety to be there. And the key is that you show up anyway. You know, my favorite metaphor to use in my practice is, how can you jump off the diving board today? Yeah. Because anxiety or whatever it is in your life that's holding you back is telling you, you can't jump off, you can't swim, you're not good enough, whatever it is. And at some point you got to just jump off. You know, you got to see that you can swim. That's what your resilience is. And I think a lot of us doubt that about ourselves. And so remembering that you have resilience, that your anxiety doesn't have to win your life, I think those are important things to hold on to. Yeah,
that's brilliant. And I've found that so many times in my own life. The thing that we're scared of doing usually is so much it's not scary once you do it, but we allow the fear and like we allow it to kind of have like a double, even if it turns out to be something bad, we allow like a double dose of whatever the bad thing is because we let it like ruin our day, like the days before we have to do the thing. And then it turns out being fine anyway. So I think the more that we can just like step into that and accept things, I think that's really, really helpful.
No, yeah, I completely agree. I mean, one of my favorite supervisors, she used to say, worrying does not change the outcome. It's like, that is a mantra I am holding on to.
Absolutely.
Because how much of the time do we use worrying as such a way to try and change things?
Yeah.
Things are going to be what they're going to be. And you have to know that whatever situation you find yourself in, you will figure out a way. Mm-hmm. And if you don't, if pain happens in your life, you will get through that too.
Yeah. I think so much of it really does come down to us trying to avoid pain, but like we're never going to fully avoid it. So
no.
That's brilliant. And last question, I ask this to everyone. The name of this podcast is Imperfect because I think we were talking about this before, but a lot of the things that we think maybe disqualify us or only we struggle with it ourselves, actually so many of us are going through those same things. And so the more we can share that, the more it actually becomes a superpower because it connects all of us. So with that, what is the quote, imperfection, that you're most proud of?
I think honestly, my own anxiety. Like I think that's why I'm called to this work, is because I live with anxiety myself. I mean, it's definitely been a journey in my own life. We didn't talk about this too much today. I've talked about it in other spaces, but my experience with my phobia, I have a metaphobia, which is a phobia of vomit, actually.
Oh, wow.
Kind of strange and different, but it's really impacted my life in a lot of ways. And, you know, even this past fall, I was finding myself having panic attacks every week. I mean, it was running my life.
Wow.
And I know how anxiety can make you feel so hopeless sometimes. I've seen it with a lot of clients where you start to become depressed because you feel like the anxiety is never going to end. And so there's this sense of hopelessness about it. And I was getting into that space myself this past fall. And, you know, anxiety can be so powerful where you do want to hold yourself back. It tells you things, and it's told me this, you know, I'm not smart enough. I should just quit speaking because I'm not funny enough, attractive enough, good enough. I mean, you insert the blank. I've had all those thoughts, right? And yet I asked myself that question at the end of my life, how would I feel if I just stayed home and didn't show up? Wow. I don't like that answer. Yeah. So to me, it's a reminder of, okay, I can't always make my anxiety go away. I'm not a magician. But I can still choose to be here even when my voice shakes or I feel like I'm going to throw up or whatever it is. I can still show up for my life. And that is something that I feel like, I suppose, is the superpower and something I want to give to each of my clients too, you know, so that they don't ever feel like anxiety is running their life too.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's so powerful. And it is, I mean, why I reached out to you is because you are making such an impact in the work you're doing. And so if you would have allowed the fear and anxiety to win, we wouldn't be having this conversation. There's a lot of people that would not have been helped and impacted. And so I think for me and anyone listening, if you can imagine the people that you're actually not going to help because of your fear, I think it's a lot easier for us to put it on us of like, oh, well, I'll be okay if I don't go out and follow my dreams. But who will you not reach then? And so that's always really kept me going because definitely like I all the time have fear of like, oh, I'm going to say the wrong thing on this podcast or whatever. I hate my voice. Like, you know, all those lies, like, but it's like, if I can just help one person, that's enough. And I know that that's something I just can see in you and your life. So thank you for doing that for all of us and for being here and sharing so much of your incredible heart and wisdom with us.
Oh, Kirsten, thanks for having me. It's so good to be in person with
I know.
you. It's like another human being.
Exactly.
It's kind of wild.
I know. It's so refreshing to not be on a Zoom screen.
I know.
Yeah. And so with that, like I just was saying, you share so much wonderful tools and content and advice. So how can listeners connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So lots of fun ways to connect. So I love speaking. And so I'm normally speaking to universities, to organizations, corporate work. So hopefully I'll be back on the road this year. We'll see where that goes. And then I do offer one-on-one career coaching. I offer group coaching for women in my course, Find Your Why, Know Your Way. Cool. And then let's see, I'm starting my private practice this fall. It's going to be called Heartship Psychological Services. So can't wait for that. Yeah. I'll be able to work with anybody in the state of California. And then the last thing is we are launching a brain health book club that I mentioned a little while ago, where every month we have a new book that we are featuring with a mental health topic. So I am super pumped about that. And I'm hoping we'll bring in the authors of the books and things like that. So hopefully people can join in.
Yeah, no, as soon as you mentioned that before, I was like, sign me up. I'm so here for that.
Good.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Lauren. And thank you everyone for listening. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Kirsten.